Hello friends, welcome back to another episode of Reddit Nuclear Revenge. I've got 5 stories in this one. The first is about an older brother going to extreme measures to get back at a shady dealer and protect his brother. The second story is a really entertaining tale of how a grandmother comes to the defense of her granddaughter, and it results in a toe being bitten off. I hope you stay for these 2 stories today and subscribe for future videos. Story 1. So, you're gonna hurt my brother? Not a good idea. Background: I'm an ex-druggie from a town that has a pretty bad gang population. I have 2 little half-brothers who live in a town nearby. My little brothers are the complete opposite of me. They get good grades, are in sports, and are very popular. We didn't get along very well back then, but I would have died for them. I love my bros. When I was 16, I had, and still have to this day, 2 good friends from the city where my brothers lived. All they did was smoke up. Well, one night, they purchased a rather large amount of pot from a new guy in town. Let's call him Shady Dealer, or SD. That night, when my friends were walking home from SD's house, a group of dudes rolled up on them, jumped them, and took everything they had. One of my friends lost eyesight in his left eye. There was nothing I could do at that point, and I had no proof that it was Shady Dealer who set them up, so nothing was done. It's now 1 year later, and I've been bare-knuckle boxing for the last 3 years with a very well-known Mexican gang to fund my habit of harder drugs. I've kept a close eye on Shady Dealer. I hear that he's planning a robbery very similar to what happened to my friends a year prior, only this time the mark is my little brother and his best friend. The setup was on a Friday night and I found out on Thursday. The revenge. I've been keeping track of this guy. I know everything about his cruddy home life. I know his dad's a construction worker and leaves at 4 in the morning. His mom is out of the picture, and that's it. Nobody else lives at home. So, at 4:15 in the morning, I jumped into his backyard, put on my balaclava and brass knuckles, took a blade, and walked right into the back door of his room. I gave him some beats, took everything of value that he had, and left him zip-tied to his toilet. The aftermath: I heard he had over 6 broken bones, and after he got out of the hospital, his dad kicked him out. I'm not entirely sure why, but he may have not liked that the house had become a target for danger. So he ended up homeless, and now he's in prison for armed robbery. Surprise, surprise. So, yeah, don't even think about hurting my family. Story 2, Granny Gator and the toe incident. Okay, let me preface this story by stating the fact that I'm well aware it sounds absolutely bat-poop insane. I also don't really condone the behavior displayed herein, including my own. My family is a dumpster fire that gives trailer trash a bad name, and unfortunately every word herein is true to the best of my recollection because it happened about 25 years ago. My grandmother started having children young. She married at 13 and had my father when she was 14, so she wasn't quite as old as my other grandmothers by the time I was born. She had full custody of me from the day I was born. I never went home from the hospital with my parents, which meant that Gigi was the only mother I ever had. My father and mother didn't want to raise me because they were too busy getting high to give a hoot about their baby. So, they just gave me to her and bounced, which is why she had me to start with. My grandmother has been dead 10 years now, and I still have nightmares about her. That's a fair indication of the type of person she was. She was vicious, mentally manipulative, and had a temper like a powder keg. One tiny spark, and it was on like Donkey Kong, 100% of the time. She was also super possessive of me to a degree that was a little terrifying. It bordered on obsession, and it was not healthy. However, it meant that when something happened to me, she had no chill at all. She could go from 0 to psycho in about 0.3 of a second, and it was, at times, a little bit uninspiring. When it wasn't directed at me, it was a bit hypocritical though, since she was basically berating the crud out of me herself on a daily basis. But apparently, in her mind, she was the only person allowed to treat me like crud. There was a particularly aggressive bully who lived near my house. He hated me, I hated him, and it was a consistently escalating problem. I was almost never allowed to go outside as a child, so when he bullied me, it was always at school, and the staff turned a blind eye to it more often than not. Well, one day I came home from school, 5th grade by the way, with a fat lip and a giant bruise on my face. My bully had managed to catch me between classes and had taken the opportunity to beat the crud out of me where nobody could see or report him for doing it. My grandmother snapped. She took me by the hand and we walked to the bully's house. I stood in the driveway watching her knock on the door. I was petrified at the time because I knew the mood she was in, and I was also scared of the bully and his mom. I was a giant ball of vaguely human-shaped anxiety, and for good reason. The bully's mom, henceforth BM, opened her door and looked at my grandmother. The conversation went essentially as follows. It's been a long time, so I can't entirely remember everything that was said. BM said, "What?" My grandmother replied, "Your son put his hands on my little girl, and this chick didn't even try to deny it. She just lit herself a cigarette and blew the smoke into my grandmother's face, daring her to do something." Now, my grandmother wasn't a big lady. She was average size and about 5 feet 5 inches tall, so not particularly intimidating physically. BM was a larger woman, about my grandmother's height but much heavier, outweighing Grandma by at least 60 pounds. So she was not impressed with my grandmother showing up at her door and gave zero hoots about her son's behavior or Gigi's feelings about it. This was a mistake. About half a second later, after BM blew the smoke into my grandmother's face, my grandmother didn't give her a single sound of warning before. She snatched BM up by the hair, dragged her out of her darn house by it onto her front porch, and then promptly threw her off, face first. It was a trailer park, so it was actually a pretty decent drop because the trailer was set up higher than normal. For my part, I was absolutely certain that BM was going to die at the time. As I said, my grandmother had issues, and that meant when she snapped, she snapped. And when that happened, she was capable of almost anything. BM took the fall like a trooper though and came up swinging. She managed to clip Gigi's cheek before Gigi got a good hold on her hair again and used it to fling her onto the ground again. My grandmother caught her a few more times before BM managed to pull her down with her. The two of them were rolling around in the dirt like a pair of angry dogs, snarling, swearing, biting, and clawing at each other. It got ugly, so very ugly. BM was a tough cookie though, I'll give her that. She was giving as good as she got for a hot minute, but she wasn't ready for what my grandmother was capable of. They wrestled on the ground for a while, but my grandmother finally got BM on her back and started feeding her knuckle sandwich after knuckle sandwich while sitting on her chest. Then BM made a terrible mistake. She tried to use one of her legs to hook my grandmother and either flip her off or kick her in the face. I'm not sure which it was, really, but the end result was that her bare foot was way too close to my grandmother's mouth. My grandmother's response was to turn her head and bite one of BM's toes clean off at the joint and spit it back into BM's face. I'll never forget the look on BM's face when it happened. It was a combination of horror and what the frick, rapidly followed by pain, because she started howling like a scalded cat. The whole time my grandmother was still beating the crud out of her. Only now BM wasn't trying to fight, she was just trying to get away because she finally realized that my grandmother was crazy and absolutely capable of destroying her with a smile on her face and a song in her heart. Someone had called the cops, and it was at this point that the cops showed up and separated the two of them. They had to pry Gigi's hands from around BM's throat to do it. BM was out cold by that point, and purple. So one officer put my grandmother in the squad car with me beside her, while the other called an ambulance for BM and looked for her toe. Then came the explanations, and most people would have been fricked by that point. They really would. But my grandmother was, without question, the best actress I've ever seen. If she'd used that skill in movies or theater, she would have won an Oscar without a doubt. It was extraordinary. She could rewrite reality, and even if you knew she was lying, she'd end up having you believing her version and questioning your own memory and sanity. To this day, I have no clue how she did it. The story she spun for the cops was one of her greatest works of fiction, and this is how it went. My grandmother claimed that I'd come home from school after being beaten and that she'd wanted to speak with BM about her son's behavior and try to work out something to correct the problem between our families in a responsible way. But when she knocked on the door and BM answered, BM was hostile from the beginning, and eventually became physically aggressive when my grandmother said that she either wanted to deal with her son or Gigi would be informing the authorities immediately. Then came the big performance, and what a performance it was. Tears started to trickle down my grandmother's face, and she used her most quivery old lady voice to say that she and I had turned to go, but BM pushed me off the porch. After I hit the ground, BM tried to do the same with my grandmother. But then my grandmother had grabbed her out of reflex, and they ended up falling together with my grandmother on top. My grandmother then claimed that the bruise I had on my face came from the fall, not the previous altercation, and that once they were both on the ground, she had just lost it. That woman had just put her hands on her child, and she was so scared that if BM kept going, she would hurt me really badly. She told the officer all of this while crying quietly. Not big sobs, nothing showy, just silent tears sliding down her face and that tiny, quivering old woman voice as she apologized for her actions because she was just so scared. Then the officer looked at me and said, "Is this what happened?" And while I'd like to say that I told the truth, that I did the right thing, and was honest with the officer about what happened, I can't, because that would be a lie. I absolutely did not do any of those things. Instead, I looked at my grandmother and let the fear and the stress of the situation just rise up and swallow me. Then I used that emotion to promptly burst into tears myself. I didn't really talk, just nodded my head and cried and clung to my grandmother, who stroked my hair and rocked me back and forth while I was trying my best not to look the officer in the eyes. I knew that I was nowhere near a good enough liar to pull it off if he was looking dead at me, so I hid my face against my grandmother's shirt and did my best to seem traumatized. He bought it, hook, line, and sinker. BM ended up being arrested for assault, disturbing the peace and possession of an illegal substance, because when they searched her, they found a small baggie of pot in her bra. BM also ended up being responsible for my grandmother's hospital bill for the sprained wrist she ended up with from pounding on BM's face like a meat bongo. The toe never got reattached, and BM ultimately ended up losing her job and going to actual jail for 4 months. She was on probation for 3 years after. My grandmother didn't catch a single charge from that day's events, and BM's family eventually moved from the trailer park. I never saw any of them again afterward. The moral of this story? Never frick with old trailer trash, ladies. You might lose a toe. Story 3. Taking down the person that caused so much pain. This isn't my story, but rather my father's revenge on my mom's dad. My parents were born in a rural part of Mexico in a small town. An important thing to note is that the area they lived in had a problem with scorpions, and the nearest hospital was a few hours away. Life wasn't exactly easy for them. My mom didn't get far in school, having been taken out of the 6th grade, while my dad didn't finish the 4th grade of elementary school. My mom grew up with a strict set of parents. Her dad was prone to violent outbursts, while her mom emotionally cut her down and sometimes got physical with her. My parents met one night when they were about 15 years old, and from what my mom said, they hit it off right away. It wasn't romantic at first, but they quickly became great friends. My dad's mom came to view her as somewhat of a daughter and would have taken her in whenever she had the chance. However, my dad was never invited to her house. For the next 2 years, life for my mom was still really difficult, especially since her father started drinking more frequently, and her mother became even more distant. There were times when my dad saw something was wrong simply because of how she walked and how she started to wince in pain from the tiniest touch. Pretty soon, they officially started dating. One day, my mom's mother simply disappeared with no explanation. This caused her dad to become even more physically violent. My mom endured all of this because, try as she might, she simply couldn't leave him. When she was 18 years old, she discovered she was pregnant with me. When she told her dad, you can only imagine what he did to her. He called her names, cut her down, telling her she was no good to him anymore, and she endured a beating. She knew she had to get out before anything worse happened. She ran to my dad's house, where she explained everything to him, how her life had been a total heck for a long time and how she was pregnant. He knew right then and there that he had to do something about it to get revenge for everything she had endured in the past. He knew simply turning her dad in wouldn't be enough. He had to make sure he was taken care of for good. My dad knew many people who worked as scorpion pest control, so he contacted them and asked which ones would be the most dangerous and lethal. Since the area we lived in was filled with scorpions, he went looking and found a few with the highest chance of producing a fatal sting. The following day, he was able to sneak into my mom's house and put the scorpions underneath her dad's bed covers and then went home. The next day, when my mom went to his house, she found him lying lifeless in his bed. She was horrified and shocked, and my dad pretended to be shocked too. They got married soon after I was born. He kept this secret for many years, and when he finally told her, she was both upset and happy that one night changed both of their lives. I think my mom's dad went a little too far in this story, but then again, I've been fortunate enough not to have to live through a horrendous situation like this. Let's get rid of your dad from this equation because he treated you badly for so many years. Also, I can't imagine the mom reacting to him after he tells her that he was the reason her dad died. You know how your dad died that one day from that scorpion? Well, that was all me. What a crazy story. Story 4. You were never my dad. Back in the mid-90s, my sister got pregnant by a guy. She was 17 and he was 18. I despised the guy with pretty much every fiber of my being. My mom, however, decided that a baby should know their father, so she invited him to come live in our house without telling me. It took me a week to calm down enough so that when I eventually came back, I didn't punch him when I walked through the door. John was a piece of work. He had great artistic talent, but all he did all day was sit in the garage and do prison tattoos for people, in addition to stealing my deceased father's power tools and pawning them for a few bucks so he could get some cigarettes. I worked a full-time job and went to school, so I would be gone 12 to 14 hours a day. But it felt like I was pulling into the driveway of a frat house, with a dozen or so people drinking and hanging out in the garage until they had to leave in the morning. I slowly curtailed that nonsense by being a giant pain in the rear to all the guests, by having their cars towed or their wheels inexplicably slashed. By the time my nephew was 2 years old, I'd managed to put a stop to the 24-hour party zone, but people would still congregate on Saturdays. A few months later, I'd had enough and threw John to the curb. My sister's friends all came forward to tell her how he'd tried to make advances on them and hit on them all the time, all the while professing his devotion to my sister and their child. I'd thrown him out, and John disappeared for 8 years. I had no idea where he went, and I didn't really care. Then, out of nowhere, we got a court summons for a custody hearing. John was suing for custody. However, in the 8 years since he disappeared, my sister had met a guy, and they got married. My nephew was formally adopted by his stepdad and changed his legal name. The first hearing was dismissed because the allegations made as the basis for the custody hearing were investigated by CPS and determined to have no substance. In fact, my nephew wasn't beaten or neglected, the house wasn't a disaster, and it wasn't in danger of falling apart. Every few months, John would file another custody hearing request until it finally got a date. John made a number of allegations, all of which were disproven by documentation and fact. Finally, the judge decided that he'd had enough and called my 10-year-old nephew up and asked him who he wanted to live with. My nephew responded, "I don't know him. He walked out of my life when I was 2. He's not my dad. Stepdad is my dad, and he, John, will never be my dad, and I don't ever want to see him again." The judge ruled against John and dismissed his custody request with prejudice. When I looked at John, he was sobbing in his chair as his mother comforted him. I sneered at him and flipped him off as I walked out of the courtroom. As to why John was missing for 8 years, apparently he'd been committed to a mental facility in Tennessee. When he got out years later, he was on SSI disability and then plotted various ways to hurt me, my sister, and my mom once he got out. The custody hearing was meant to be the culminating event, but fortunately, John was an idiot, and we had enough money to hire a good attorney. A few years later, John tried to mend some fences with my nephew and invited him to come down to where he lived and meet his relatives, including a half-brother my nephew didn't even know he had. This is in addition to the half-brother and sister he has from his mom and adoptive father. When my nephew was 15, almost 16, we received a call that John was dead. Someone had blown his brains out as he sat on the couch in his mobile home. I felt sorry for John's girlfriend and her son, but for John, I didn't feel a thing. A journalist tracked my nephew down a few months later and filled us in on some details. Apparently, John had been targeted as a result of moving into someone else's territory to distribute drugs. The would-be kingpin paid a guy a few $100, and the promise of an ATV to get rid of him. Typical redneck retribution, I guess. The journalist asked my nephew for a quote, and he said, "Sure, I wish I could meet the man who did this to him." "Why is that?" the journalist asked. "So I could shake his hand. John was never my dad, and I won't miss him." That's one savage kid. Story 5, Marvin's Killdozer. Sometime in the early 2000s, there was a small town in Colorado called Granby. Among the residents, there was a muffler repair shop owner named Marvin Heemeyer. He was sort of a cool guy, though I don't know how to describe him. He also got along with some people. One day, a company was going to build a concrete plant right next to his shop. Marvin was against the idea, but he was alone. The construction of the plant would cut off the only entrance to his shop. Marvin tried to get people to sign a petition, but he couldn't get enough signatures. He decided that he was going to make his own entrance to the shop and bought everything he needed to do so. The city denied his request to build a new road. Eventually, the concrete plant cut off Marvin's sewage, and the city fined him for it. This was the last straw. Marvin started constructing a tank of sorts, using the materials he had gathered to build a new road to his shop. One of the items was a bulldozer. He recorded himself often and eventually finished what he called the Killdozer. Despite its name, it didn't harm anyone. He designed it so that when the armor was lifted onto the bulldozer, it wasn't coming off. Marvin got into the bulldozer, lifted the armor onto it, and drove the killdozer through his shop and into the concrete plant. He then went to the city and destroyed buildings of those who had wronged him, such as the newspaper plant that he believed had lied about him, the former mayor's house, and the town hall. He destroyed many more buildings. The governor of Colorado even considered destroying the killdozer with heckfire missiles, but that idea was scrapped for obvious reasons. When Marvin was destroying a shop, the radiator started leaking and the bulldozer broke down. Marvin then shot himself. At first, when I was reading this story, I thought for sure it was some crazy story that was made up, but everything in the story actually happened. As I was scrolling through the comments, it turns out that Marvin may not have been a good guy in this situation. Here's one of the comments from the post. No, Marvin was actually a jerk. He was a paranoid guy who thought the government was out to get him and that he was on a mission from God. He bought his land for $42,000 in 1992 and was later offered $250,000 for it, which he initially agreed to before backing out and demanding $1 million for it. So it's not like he was being screwed over, he just wanted confrontation. While the killdozer didn't harm anyone, it wasn't for lack of trying. Most of the buildings he destroyed were occupied moments before he destroyed them, including the town library, which wasn't listed in the story, which was hosting a children's program at the time it was destroyed. The former mayor's house he destroyed. That mayor died 3 years prior, and only his widow lived there now. The newspaper that lied about him? Wrong. They had even published all his letters of protest. It's not their fault that he didn't win over anyone's opinion. From gun ports he fired at state troopers who hadn't taken action against him. He also fired on propane tanks that, had they ignited, would have also destroyed a senior center nearby. Hey friends, I hope you enjoyed these 2 nuclear revenge stories. Let me know in the comments below if you think these 5 stories deserve the Nuclear Revenge badge. If you aren't subscribed, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. See you guys in the next one.